start. We are born again. Open your heart. Spend this time in your head.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today, I am recording with Dave Feldman. Dave, welcome to the channel. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me on, Amy.
You are very welcome. So can you do me a favor, give everyone a little bit of a rundown of who you are and probably about what topic we're going to be talking about today?
So I'm actually an engineer, software platform developer who became obsessed with the study of cholesterol, particularly lipids. It's known as lipidology. And starting about 7 years ago, after I saw my cholesterol jump, going on a low-carb ketogenic diet.
I love that. And yes, I figured we would talk about cholesterol. Thought that was a pretty safe topic. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background of why it kind of has come back up again as a topic that a lot of people are concerned about. I went low carb 4 years ago, did the really high fat in the beginning, and then kind of petered out and went towards the high protein. And I stayed high protein for quite a while, a lot lower fat, did not work well for me at all, had a lot of issues. So I have gone back to my roots of like 80 to 90% fat on protein, much lower, because I've since come to find out I have Lyme disease, I have autoimmune conditions, I have all these things, and my pain is almost completely gone as
Wow.
long as I do the higher fat. And I got myself into some pretty deep states of ketosis. So then, of course, the question and the concern is, what is all of that fat doing to my body? So can you share your story about how you said your numbers jumped up sky high for your when you went low carb?
Yeah, and it's of course a common thread for anybody who doesn't already know. For everybody who does, this will be a little bit of a review, but takes just a few minutes to recap. In essence, in 2015, I had gotten an A1C of 6.1 for the second year in a row. And because diabetes is so rampant on my dad's side of the family, I became obsessed with trying to figure out how I could prevent it from going higher and higher. And at that time, LCHF, low carb, high fat, was becoming more prominent. Keto wasn't really that big yet, but low carb, high fat sounded amenable. And I was like, okay, this sounds great. But I remember at that time I was talking about this on the forums because it seemed as if a lot of people on the forums were saying, hey, this works for me. But a lot of the institutions like the ADA and the Mayo Institute, they seem to say, for diabetes, it's progressive. You're going to have to just try to manage it as it continues going on its own. But yet there were so many people who seemed to have compelling data on the forums that I was like, well, I could just try it out and test. And so I started doing it, and my BMI at the time, I want to say, was maybe 26, but almost nobody thought of me as overweight, including myself, save maybe 5-10 pounds. And yet after going on this low carb, high fat diet, even though I was mainly trying to avoid diabetes, all these other things kept improving that I just kind of thought came with getting older. Because almost everybody my age, as I'm getting older, we all would gain weight, 5-10 pounds per decade. That was just standard, right? And here I am returning to my weight, in college, like easily, closer to high school, actually. And it started rearranging the way I thought about things. But on top of that, I had other issues like IBS, like mild IBS. But again, just kind of assuming that that's just, getting older, right? But sure enough, the one thing I was asking about with these forums was, hey, what about cholesterol though? Like if I'm eating a whole lot of saturated fat and cholesterol itself, like I'm consuming more cholesterol, is it just going to, increase the cholesterol in my blood and then I get a heart attack? And most people said at that time, actually, it's pretty rare. Some people see it increase, but it's just a small number of people. And since I started the ketogenic diet, or since I started low carb, high fat, my dad and my sister both got inspired to do it. Both of them had hypertension, but my dad was like full blown type 2 diabetic, A1C of 8.1. And both of them saw huge improvements, and they all started around the same time. They got their blood work back before I did, 6 months in. And because their blood work came back and their cholesterol hadn't gone up substantially, I was feeling confident. Oh, good. When I get my blood work, it probably will be the same. But mine had jumped up like crazy. Theirs had gone up maybe 10, maybe 20%. Mine had gone up over 100%. And so I freaked out. But on top of that, the engineer in me was like, hey, wait a sec. My first degree relatives, they didn't see this increase. But to be fair, and they would acknowledge this, they weren't as metabolically healthy as I was, which was a weird paradox. Like, you kind of tend to think the people who are metabolically unhealthy are going to be the ones who have the high cholesterol. Yet, strangely, I was the one who saw the big jump. And that was the first beginnings of the pattern. I noticed a lot of other people who seemed to be leaner and seemed to be more metabolically healthy were the ones more likely to see this increase in their cholesterol. And so that was the very beginnings of what I now term as the lipid energy model, which is what I've been working with since then. Those were the early days, developing that I've now developed with like PhDs and MDs and so forth, that we published this year, actually, which helps to hopefully explain what we think is the reason for this.
That is fascinating that there's that correlation that the healthier you are, the higher your is it specifically your LDL that ends up going up the highest?
Yes. And again, this is a loose correlation. It hasn't been fully validated, but generally speaking, the leaner and the more metabolically healthy, seemingly, the more likely it is that you'll see a higher response, this hyper response. And in fact, you've probably heard by now this phenotype I refer to regularly, which we also have in the literature, which aren't just hyper responders, but lean mass hyper responders, LMHR. And it's true. What they were saying on the forums is true in the sense that at that time, most people who were going on low carb, high fat were folks who were more metabolically challenged, such as somebody who's already, say, obese, and they go on the diet and they're moving to more of like an overweight. But again, I was already a BMI of like 26, and I end up going to BMI of something closer to 23, 24. I was already pretty metabolically healthy. I was mainly just trying to avoid my pre-diabetes moving into full-blown diabetes. And we think that that's part of the answer to the question, that because you're leaner, you have to traffic more of the fat around your body, and the vehicles that your body makes to move around the fat also have a passenger called cholesterol in the same vehicles, and that can explain why there's higher levels found in the blood when you're both metabolically healthy and you're powered by fat.
I love your analogy of the taxis, and that LDL is kind of the taxi, the shuttle that takes the energy around to the cells. When I heard that, it really kind of put me at ease a little bit. And I know that there are people who are very unhealthy and they have very high LDL, but it's different for them. And my understanding is because when you're insulin resistant, the cells don't open for you to be able to receive the LDL particle again back into the liver to be able to fuel back up again and then take more fuel out. Am I understanding that right? Or is there something that I'm missing?
Well, there's definitely been a lot of advancements. I mean, this is kind of the catch. If you've been following me throughout this journey, you're literally watching in real time as I'm not only finding out more and more, but a lot of what I'm finding out is sort of, I mean, this really is kind of a new frontier. lipidologists aren't focused as much on the biochemistry relevance of fatty acid delivery in the context of the low carb diet. And these vehicles that you're talking about, even back then, I would refer to low density lipoproteins as a class opposite high density lipoproteins. But now, well, it's a little more technically accurate. It's a little bit more of a mouthful. I would specify ApoB containing lipoproteins. I know that's a lot, but let me break it down this way because I can simplify it a bit more. I'm sure you've heard of ApoB, and probably many of your people watching have heard ApoB, but it's kind of complicated in that it's typically described as this protein that's on LDL, but it's also on these other classes of lipoproteins, such as VLDL, chylomicrons, and so forth. But I can simplify this a little bit for you. ApoB is the true boat. That's the big shift that I've had personally, is that rather than calling these different lipoproteins boats, the truth is actually that ApoB protein, that's the only thing that's truly fixed and immutable. Everything else that it's attached to, not just the contents on the inside of the lipoprotein, but the surface components as well, all of those are immutable. They're coming on and they can be exchanged. But ApoB, that protein, you can think of it as the master carrier protein. And its job, just remember this part, its job is to start big and to get small as it drops off its lipids. Everything on it is there to be ultimately dropped off or to ultimately get reabsorbed, right? And this is the key. The key is, if you can keep that in mind, keep this other part in mind, which is where the problems occur, is when there's a failure to drop off the cargo. What do you see? Well, you see a lot of ApoB containing lipoproteins, as well as a lot of their cargo sitting there in the bay, right? They're not getting to their target destinations. So getting back to what you're talking about, and that cells are not taking things up, yeah, actually that is a part of the story. There seems to be a lack of cells, or you can almost say there's a lack of parking, right, for where it is that we're trying to get that to. So people who are maxing out, I'm sure you've heard the term personal fat threshold. It's a bit of a simplification, but not too much of a simplification, because our subcutaneous fat cells, they're supposed to be engaged. We're supposed to be regularly staging and pacing them. You know, your FedEx, for example, we all have a local FedEx, a distribution center. So when something's coming to me from like Russia, or if it's even coming to me from a state nearby, like Colorado, it's not coming straight to my door off the plane. It's actually going to somewhere very local, very near my house, whose job it is to deliver it to my house. Well, that's what adipocytes are, particularly subcutaneous fat. It's spread all around our body. And so we have this constant redistribution of the fat that we're consuming to our local subcutaneous fat cells so that they could be available to the local oxidative tissues that make use of it. That's like the neighborhood, right? So getting back to why it is that I think as you're leaner, it becomes more relevant. Well, what if you have less of those centers, but much larger neighborhoods? So you have smaller fat mass, but you have larger muscle tissue. Well, does that mean that you're going to need more delivery, more global delivery? Yeah, I would argue that that is the case. And therefore, you need more of these ApoBs to move more of these lipids around globally inside of your body. And while that's a bit of a simplification, it's not too far off. That's kind of the big overview of the lipid energy model.
Okay, that is fascinating. I mean, there's really no other way for me to put that. I love how you explain all of that. You paint this picture in my head, and then it sits there, and then it makes it so much easier for me to hang on to. I hope that my viewers feel the same way. So a couple of questions to go off of that would be, one, can you get on your regular cholesterol panel, can you get your ApoB number? Does it matter? How can you interpret that? Because I have mine from my most recent panel that I got. My total cholesterol was 275. My triglycerides were 49. My HDL was 100. My VLDL was 7. It's always 7. It's always 7, no matter what, across from day one, it's always been 7. And then my LDL is only 168. Actually used to be a lot higher than that until I ended up with Lyme disease and autoimmune problems. And now I can't get it above 200. I actually feel best with it above 200. But is there a way to get the ApoB tested or not?
Well, yes. In fact, it's a little conflict of interest I'll concede right here. We actually run a service called Own Your Labs, where people can order it privately. It doesn't come in a standard lipid panel. The panel you just described is a standard lipid panel where it's got it has total and LDL and HDL and triglycerides. Those 4 are typical for a standard lipid panel. Now, for ApoB, you typically order the test directly. And so as part of the blood work you're getting, you say you get your ApoB. And I do think it's better to get your ApoB alongside your standard lipid panel, because the standard lipid panel is effectively the cargo count on a per unit of blood measurement, right? The ApoB is effectively the vehicle count of that particular vehicle, right? And we talked about ApoB, we haven't talked about HDL yet, but I do want to go next to triglycerides, because triglycerides are a measure of fat in the blood. And so what we would argue with the lipid energy model is that's actually what you're delivering more of and more rapidly. What a lot of folks can't help but do, and it's understandable, is you see a marker in your blood and you think it's reflective of how much you're producing something, or even how much you're trafficking something. And in the case of triglycerides, that's why there's a lot of folks, including good friends of mine who are in the world of low carb, who are like doctors, who believe that if your triglycerides are going down, it's because there's less secretion of these ApoB that are triglyceride rich, like VLDL. And we're actually arguing the opposite, that you're actually secreting a lot of VLDL, but it's coupled with a more rapid turnover of it. You're dropping it off faster. And to make this intuitive, all you have to do is think of high carb athletes. Really metabolically healthy high carb athletes, do they have glucose levels in the 200s or 300s? No, they don't. They have very low glucose levels because they're turning over their glucose levels rapidly. I would argue that's what you're doing with the numbers you just told me. Like many lean mass hyperresponders, your triglycerides are lower. They're 49. Your VLDL, your measurable amount of VLDL, is really low. So of course, a lot of people would go, oh, well, so that you must not be secreting or making a lot of VLDL. And I'd go, no, I think that for the same reason that if you went out to, a very busy port, right, and you saw a whole bunch of empty ships, you wouldn't go, oh, those empty ships are unused. No. On the contrary, we have a lot of empty ships that are really busy. They're busy moving cargo. It's just that they're rapidly dropping that cargo off, right? And this brings me around to HDL, because HDL is kind of the third part of this. The reason your HDL is higher is it's actually a proxy for that turnover. So when your HDL cholesterol levels are higher, there's lots of different reasons for that. But in the lipid energy model, we would argue a big part of why we see this as part of the overall triad with lean mass hyperresponders is because a lot of the cholesterol coming off of the VLDL as it's remodeling, you know how I said the ApoB starts big but gets small? Well, you can think of HDL as its job is the opposite. It starts small and gets big. So you probably heard the story as I did, that actually what's happening is ApoB is delivering cholesterol into your tissues, and HDL is taking it back out of your tissues. That's actually part true, but mostly not true. Most of what's coming out of these VLDL, these bloated ApoB containing lipoproteins and the chylomicrons, most of their cargo is coming either into the tissues for what the tissue specifically wants, or a lot of its contents, including its surface area, actually is taken up by the HDL boats that are hanging out and waiting for this transformation. And they pick up a lot of those surface components, including the cholesterol. And that's why it makes perfect sense when, looking back, I didn't realize this at the time, I could consume a whole bunch of saturated fat, just total overall keto. I'm sure you've heard of the Feldman protocol. And you'd see that my LDL would go down. But there were two other things that would happen at the same time I couldn't explain at that time. My triglycerides would go down more than where they were at their baseline. And my HDL would go up more than it was at my baseline. And I mean by a lot. I'm talking like going from, say, in its 50s to its 70s. Well, is it because all of a sudden my HDL particles were just pulling out that much cholesterol out of my arteries? No, I would argue what was happening was that I was consuming a lot more food. And guess what? My subcutaneous fat was taking up more of those particles. So there's more turnover of the VLDL, more LDL, and literally more of the LDL being taken up by the adipocytes so that they could grow to accommodate the contents. The greater turnover meant more of the triglycerides would go, I'm literally putting them in, to the adipocytes. And the HDL, this is where it's beautiful. The HDL, being the final part of the proxy of that turnover, goes way, way, way up. Why? Because it's showcasing that turnover is happening. That's why the triad, that's why looking at these three together is so crucial. It's not just the high LDL, it's looking at them in combination with the high HDL and the low triglycerides. That's why I think we see this so ubiquitously across the population of low carbers.
Okay, well, then it sounds like I'm good. I'm doing pretty good. No issues with my triad.
Maybe. Because here's the thing. This is a hypothesis, right? It's an untested hypothesis. That's why we're doing the LMHR study out of Lundquist. We want to actually look, because I've got to acknowledge, the critics could be right. It could be those of us going on a low carb diet, myself included, by moving in a lot more fat. I could be right about the lipid region model. It could be we were trafficking more of these ApoB, and it could be more of the ApoB really does convert to a lot more risk. It's possible. That's why we've got to get the data, right? If we get the data and we see at a population level, this isn't associated with a higher risk, well, then we go on to the next steps.
I wanted to be a part of that study, but you're in California and I'm over here in Wisconsin. And so it was a little bit of a ways for me to go.
We fly participants from wherever they're at.
How did I not know that? Oh my gosh, I totally would have signed up then. My husband's the one that told me about it. And I was like, yeah, I should do that, because both of us, my LDL used to be a lot higher, but it's since gone down since I've gotten these other diagnoses. I don't know if it's connected or not. I am really glad though that you did your plug, shameless plug, for Own Your Labs, because I have a lot of people that are sick and tired of going to their doctors because of the fight, and they've been asking about how do you get labs. So please shamelessly plug away right here, and I will make sure to put it down in the description as well for anyone who wants to order anything.
Yeah, I mean, basically what it came down to is Siobhan and I, we were just doing tons of experiments. Because of that, we kept getting more and more bulk like value through the physician we were ordering it through, which he loved because then he could get better and better prices. And we were like, actually, we could use this opportunity to advance citizen science. Because while there are other services that are online that allow for private ordering, and we'll even tell you about them, we go with whatever the best one is. I wanted to build a platform where, as you're getting to the checkout, you also have the opportunity, we incentivize you. We give it a constant 10% discount. It's always there if you're willing to provide your anonymized data to this data pool that we want to make open access for both formal and citizen researchers alike. Because this is the issue. The issue is that if you've followed me for a while, I'm very vocal about this. There's such a lack of transparency in science that I think is just terrible. And we don't have a lot of data on low carbers in particular. And I want there to just be more accessible data that could be made use of. So Own Your Labs wasn't just about, having another way for people to get private blood work. It's strictly an opt-in. You can choose not to, but an opt-in if you want to help contribute to the overall cause of citizen science. And that was the genesis of making it. And I'm excited to say we have about an 85% of those who do opt in for it up to this point. But yeah, basically you choose the blood tests you want. We offer over 300 in our catalog. A lot of people get a lot of advanced lipid tests. There are some that we love, especially. I mean, you mentioned Apob, but there's others that we're very interested in, such as free fatty acids. That's very relevant to the model. A lot of people get inflammatory markers, of course, C-reactive protein, but some are a little more esoteric and interesting, like TNF alpha and IL-6 and so forth. And it's great because it's unlocking a whole lot of new, great data for us to all look at together.
So for anyone who says, I wish that they would do studies on us low carbers, this is a way for you to participate in exactly that. And you said it's anonymous, so no one's going to even know whose data it is, correct?
Yes, so when you opt in for it, we remove first name, last name, date of birth, and city. And of course, it's in a larger pool. So, and we're waiting until we have a fairly colossal amount before we go ahead and put it online. But yeah, we otherwise just ask a couple other demographic pieces of information that we know researchers will be interested in. But it's a way to participate. Myself, I love it because it's also the ability to provide a lot of longitudinal data as well. So if you're getting repeat tests, it's helpful because then people can also look at trajectories and things along those lines. But yeah, it's again, I knew that it wasn't good enough for me to just complain about it a lot. I wanted to find a way to literally be materially a part of the process of helping it out. And I'm so happy to have Siobhan helping me put this together. She fulfills a lot of the orders, and it's doing great. It's a fantastic service. So
perfect. No shame in that at all. I actually record with her later this week too. Just
that's great.
A little sneak peek for everyone to know that that's coming as well. So back to you made a statement about our fat in our body. And I've been wondering this question for a little while. Maybe you can answer it for me. When we eat fat, how long does it take us to actually use the fat that we've eaten? Do we use it immediately, or does it go into fat cells and we unpack and we exchange? Because you said exchange. So I've always wondered that if I were to go eat some beef fat right now, how long would it take me to actually use that? And what's that process look like?
Well, this is where it gets kind of interesting, because the truth is some amount does end up coming through your gut into circulation of the food you just now consumed. However, a very large proportion of it is what was actually in the enterocytes of your gut from the meal previously. So it's almost kind of like a queue, if you will, as there are various stages of movement coming into circulation and use, and to some degree of what's actually coming out of your existing adipocytes. Now, if you're on a mixed diet, then your body's pretty smart. It will often utilize glucose to the levels that it makes sense, and utilize fat to the levels that it makes sense. But it's utilizing glucose. Typically, it has what's known as oxidative priority. And again, it depends on a number of different factors. But generally speaking, if you're on a predominantly carb-centric diet, then much of the fat that's getting put into circulation is usually meant to be put towards adipocytes during a period of time in which you're just eating or postprandial. But then, assuming you're healthy and your glucose levels aren't over the top and you don't have hyperinsulinemia, et cetera, then when you head to sleep, you should be getting into a fasted state. You should be getting more from your adipocytes. You should actually be lipolyzing more of those fatty acids should be coming out, and then your tissue should be oxidating those as well, right? But if you're powered by fat, you're intentionally getting your glycogen stores lower, particularly your hepatic glycogen stores lower. You're telling your body, I actually want more lipolyzing, full body lipolysis, because I want more full body turnover in those adipocytes. And therefore, more of those fatty acids are coming out. They're getting packaged into the Apob containing lipoproteins, as well as getting used by oxidative tissues. And so there's just an overall systemic, larger usage in play in that circumstance. But to the degree with which we can isolate and specify how much of the fat from food you just ate is actually going to get specifically oxidized as opposed to stored, I feel like we're not, I mean, that's part of the frontier. I feel like there's not enough research on that level of specificity. You probably already have heard this many times before, because this is certainly another place where I get very vocal, but there's unfortunately a lot of studies that claim to be looking at low carb that don't use it in the same way that the low carb community would use the term low carb, right? So I myself, I think of low carb as at least hitting a certain threshold of that turnover I just described, systemic turnover, and likely having at least some measurable levels of ketones in regular circulation through the day, as opposed to overnight in the fasted state, right? And obviously, if you're fully ketogenic, it's because that's a substantial amount of what you're making use of, particularly for the brain. That I really do want to see. How much is the fate of these fatty acids you're consuming, and how fast are they used versus stored and so forth? I think that that's going to be really fascinating data the more it emerges.
So then, do you know, is there like a carb number that would supersede that threshold and make it null and void after that?
I think it's very individualistic, because because there already is a lot of these unknown aspects with that metabolic challenge state we're talking about, right? Like this is why I press a lot and really want us to be doing a lot more research in general on healthy populations. It's very unfortunate, but so much of our research comes from populations that have existing illness, and then we extrapolate that over to the healthy populations. I really dislike that process. I really wish we spent like half of our money in studying people who we knew to be in a healthy state, so that we could have better understandings of baseline and how things are working mechanistically. And this is one of those areas, right? So yeah, if you grab a population of 100 people who you feel confident are metabolically healthy, and by metabolically healthy, I mean they've got a good balance of anabolism and catabolism such that they can move energy in and out, or I should say energy potential as in fuel. Okay, what is that level? How low do we need to have the carbs to then observe a level of ketosis that we could then start defining in that context? Because unfortunately, that's going to be different when we look to folks who are metabolically challenged. If you already have, say, a lot of visceral fat or a lot of ectopic fat, I mean, I know this anecdotally with a lot of my own family and friends. There seems to be a very fits and starts version of regaining of metabolic health. So I'm sure you know who Amy Berger is, of course.
Oh, yes.
One of my favorite charts that she's ever put out, she goes, what you expect your weight loss journey to be. And it's this perfect linear straight yeah, exactly. And I've never met anybody who does that, right? Even the people who tout that it's been every week, it's been about this amount, right? That happens for maybe 3 weeks or something like that. And then, yeah, they'll hit a stall, or they'll have a huge drop, and then they're just feeling on top of the world. And then it's because the starting point is a starting point after having had this whole lifestyle and who knows what other aspects that brought you to a point where you felt it was important to go on a diet to interventionally to change it. That shouldn't be where the starting point is of our understanding for physiology. We should already be starting, in my opinion, with interventions in existing healthy populations to better understand what the physiology would do under these circumstances, because then it's a better baseline, in my opinion.
In your very humble opinion. So you mentioned ketosis a couple of times. Where do you think ketosis starts? Like, what would be in this realm of ketosis? Because there's some people that are going for the really high numbers, the really deep levels of ketosis, and then there are some that are, well, 0.5 is good. So is there a magic number, I guess?
Not for me. In fact, it's the opposite. I push back on a lot of my close friends and family who try to set that line, and especially if they try to set that line high. So I know a lot of lean mass hyperresponders who have like 0.3 millimoles, but you get them in to get what I consider to be the true gold standard, which is an RER, or respiratory exchange ratio. That's where you're actually getting the exhaust. Literally, you're getting the exhaust of the exchange ratio between fat and carbohydrate oxidation, right? So you actually, that is an aggregate of your cells overall. So you can really see what they're burning and not burning. Unfortunately, if you're getting a blood test for beta hydroxybutyrate, which is typical for like Keto Mojo, it's a decent proxy to an extent, but there's a catch. The catch is it's not the exhaust. It's in fact the quantity that's found in the blood at a given moment. Well, I love blood work, obviously. But the catch is what you're looking at is something that is in transit, but not yet in use. So getting back to what I was saying earlier with, an athlete who has high levels of glucose, I don't expect high levels of glucose in an athlete, right? Why? Because they're utilizing it much faster. Do I think it's possible that lean mass hyperresponders often have lower beta hydroxybutyrate than, say, their sedentary counterparts because there's greater usage? Yeah, I think that's one reason. I think there's something else too, though. Not to get a little complicated, bear with me for a second. We're not really on a ketogenic diet in the way that, or at least in the way that I was initially taught, because when I was first getting into this, it was like, oh, all of our fatty acids are getting converted to ketones to then power us with ketones. That was not true. As I was understanding and learning about lipidology, no. Actually, a proportion in less than 50% gets converted to ketones. The rest remain as fatty acids, get packaged into these cargo that these lipoproteins send out, right? These are the two pathways in the liver. Sorry, there really are more pathways. I'm going to say these are the two predominant pathways. Sorry, I got to be technically accurate on this one. But yes, ketogenesis being one way, right? Fatty acids getting converted to triglycerides that then go out as cargo being the other way. Okay, if you're a lean mass hyperresponder, you tend to be fit and athletic. Well, guess what your muscle cells, both cardiac and skeletal muscle, prefer? Well, they love fat. They love directly fatty acids. They like ketones too, but they not only like fatty acids, they like triglycerides off of lipoproteins, right? Because think about it from this perspective. One of these carbs, they're going to be in the 30s for ATP yield. One of these fatty acids all by themselves, maybe 100 and change for ATP yield. Yeah, same thing for ketone bodies. But if you look at a triglyceride has something in the neighborhood of, I want to say, 460 ATP yield if you look at all three fatty acids plus the glycerol backbone. So a VLDL that's coming from your liver, it's a tanker. It has 2,500 triglycerides, right? So when a cell says, I need a lot of fuel, instead of one of these three that I just mentioned, if it can go for the lipoprotein, it can get a lot of fuel from one binding to one of these bloated lipoproteins, right? Again, they're like a tanker. They're a huge ship. One of the most fascinating things I ran into when researching for the lipid energy model is something called lipoprotein lipase, which is very central to the model. It's a lipoprotein lipase is an enzyme that helps hydrolyze those fatty acids out. So cells make use of it. They attach, they express this, they pull it out. They were able to delete on rodent models, delete lipoprotein lipase so that in just cells from the heart, so cardiomyocytes, right? When they did this so that rodent hearts could not make use of lipoproteins, they would have regular heart failure because they could not compensatorily utilize any of the other energy substrates. The ones I just mentioned, free fatty acids, ketones, glucose, could not come up with enough such that they would have heart failure. Okay, so this brings me right back to lean mass hyperresponders. I think lean mass hyperresponders are proportionally moving a bit more towards fatty acid usage, a little bit less towards the ketogenesis pathway. They're using both for sure, but the setting, if you will, is a little bit more towards the fatty acid usage. And that could be relevant if you're looking at your beta hydroxybutyrate levels in your blood. I know there was like a long explanation to get around to why do I find less there? But at the end of the day, as the engineer, I'm going to say, I think you're looking at the wrong place. You should look at the actual oxidation of fat. Look at your RER, right? Because if you're wanting to be powered by fat, you should see what the output of what that looks like is. Don't get too obsessed with the number that might come off your BHB if you feel great and if your performance is through the roof, because the number isn't going to tell you enough.
Yeah, I've started really looking more into the breath ketone meters.
Acetone, right.
And I wasn't sure because I've heard that that's a better indication than what's in your blood. And I'm like, one step at a time, give me a minute to like macerate over this, deal with this. But now I'm starting to move over to the breath ketone meters. So how do you feel about those? Do you think that they're worth anything?
Well, Dorian from Keto Mojo has a great presentation on this, and there's actually some problems long term with the sensors for the acetone meters that I couldn't fully unpack for you. I can say this, given what I just described a bit in detail with lean mass hyperresponders, I suspect in time we'll actually be able to see acetone to LDL ratio, because I suspect they actually are utilizing less ketones relatively to the fatty acids. Again, talking about that pathway shift, right? So that brings it back to me talking to you. Is what you're going to see in that meter going to change what it is that you eat? Because you're going to take it for granted that that's a measurement of how in ketosis you are. And I would push back that I don't know that that's going to give you that level of accuracy in the same way as something like an RER.
Yeah, I started out with super high fat and went back to the super high fat. And I've started shifting a little bit. And people would probably be horrified to know that my keto numbers are not what they used to be. I used to be able to get them in the 3s and 4s super easy. And now I'm like, yeah, I'm nowhere near that now, but my pain is still gone.
Yeah, exactly. This is my point. This is what as much as I love blood work and I love numbers, I'm also kind of fascinated on a sort of sociological standpoint as to how much people let the numbers become their means of feeling good or bad about themselves, right? So I'm sure you've heard the term treat the person, not the numbers, and that's usually directed to physicians. I kind of wish patients would think that way too, right? Like, for sure, be aware of measurements of disease, which is why I care about this LMHR study, right? So regardless of what the numbers are, let's not look at proxies. Let's look at the actual physical detection of the disease. Well, same thing with somebody who's working with some disease and they find keto's working for them. They get a little bit down the road and now they're actually checking other numbers to get a sense of progress because they're feeling so good. They're just looking for something to suggest that they may not be doing so well, right? But I'm an engineer. I'm still coming back to the person. It's kind of like going, up until recently, all loud cars, the louder they were, the more it showed that they weren't working, right? And that was when all cars had the same number of cylinders. Okay, so now somebody invented a car with more cylinders, and they're like, but we know loud cars associate with more broken cars. It's like, well, okay, let's then study this new car with these extra cylinders before we jump to that conclusion, right? That's how I feel about looking at these markers without the context. Look, again, it's new territory. Until we have more data as to what long-term outcomes are, particularly with these, trend curves, we don't know what the utilization is versus non-utilization. But the reason I already feel somewhat skeptical is because I can goose my numbers right now. I could have high ketones tomorrow, not from undereating, but I can have, say, a fat shake tonight, right? And when I consume the fat shake, so a shake with heavy whipping cream, what I believe will be the reason for my higher ketone levels tomorrow is because I've actually goosed the numbers. I've brought in a lot of fat and therefore installed a kind of traffic jam such that there's an underutilization for what it is that I already brought into the bloodstream, right? That's what I think is the Occam's razor for that outcome. But that doesn't mean I'm going to go, I'm more in ketosis because I had the fat shake just before I went to sleep. No, I don't think that at all, right? I want to look at the exhaust product and I want to feel more confident that the exhaust product of fatty acid utilization is the more accurate one, even if that one's not perfect.
And that's exactly what I did for a while because I was so worried about the numbers that I would drink a fatty drink just before bed, a fatty bedtime tea, and I had fabulous numbers. But I also think that was actually part of my healing though, because my pain from the Lyme disease, my neck locks up and I can't turn my head right or left, and it radiates down to my shoulders and my back, and I can't move, I can't drive. That completely went away when I flooded my body with fat. And so then I became a little bit obsessed with chasing my numbers to make sure I kept my numbers up. But then my numbers would drop and I'm still not in pain. And so when I went too high, I upped my protein a little bit too high for me, and instantly I was in pain again. So for me, it seems to be more about keeping the protein at a certain level and then not overdoing the fat, because I was like trying to get as much as I could in. So now I'm playing with it just to kind of see what happens, and how I feel is taking precedence over what my meter says, because that became too important to me. And I was like, this is not, one, it's not sustainable to continue to check every single day. And then living on 90% fat. I mean, it does kind of help with the bills a little bit when you're not buying tons of protein, but that was my fun little detour off, and I've had fun with it and it's been amazing. My pain is almost completely gone, but I don't want to be obsessed with these numbers. So to hear an engineer who is obsessed with numbers say, don't obsess about the numbers, kind of like it. I like it.
Exactly. Well, and it's not just that. We're wired as humans to think in smaller time spans than we should for many different things. So a lot of times what we think is cause effect related, because we often narrow our measurements for things diet related to a single meal or a single day as a unit. But the more you learn about metabolism, the more you're like, why would we ever think that? There's so many things. I'll give you a good example. One of the most exciting, this is going to get a little geeky, but bear with me for a sec. One of the most exciting experiments for me is one that had a full replication. I ate 5 days in one phase where it was eucaloric, or basically maintenance levels. Then I would drop to exactly half those calories for 5 days. Then I would increase the calories, and this was all keto. The ratio was all keto all the way through. So maintenance, hypocaloric, and then hypercaloric, but all still keto ratio, right? And when I did this, you could see these trends. My weight would remain relatively stable. My weight would go down when I was hypocaloric, totally understandable. My weight would increase when I was hypercaloric. But what's fascinating is in the 24-hour period, really 36-hour period, immediately following my going from hypo to hyper, I'd have this little phase where my triglycerides would go ridiculously high. And then they would drop way down and then eventually drop super, super low. And that little period of time where they were ridiculously high would be in contrary to what the rest of the whole trend line is for the whole rest of that last phase. And for a while, I was really wondering about that as to whether that was just an error with that first experiment. But then I replicated the full 15-day experiment with all 3 phases, and that exact same spike came back in for the second time around. And then I kind of like banged my head against the wall and then had the big light bulb moment. I was like, wait a sec. I'm quite literally moving from a context of weight loss and being absolutely in a state of release to moving to weight gain. Why would I think that all of my cells would have all of the enzyme machinery and everything? Because you learn about cells in the nucleus and transcribing and transcription and so forth. And you're like, no, all these things take time. And so I joke when I present the data now that it's not overnight, but it's close to 2 overnights, right? But that's super relevant to me when I'm looking at data and why it was so helpful to do it at that high frequency. So it's not even so much, hey, be afraid of taking regular measurements. Just don't make your regular measurements become something you react so strongly to. Part of why I like to take frequent measurements is so that I become almost unconscious as to the collection of them. But then I assess them in a longer term frame, and it helps me personally to better understand what's going on. But it takes that kind of schizophrenia, right? On one end, I'm trying to constantly collect, but I'm collecting so much that I'm becoming numb to the process. That's a good place to be, because then when I'm coming back for the larger analysis, it becomes easier to make better decisions.
Yes, I love that clarity of it's okay. It's not your everything to react. Like if you get on the scale, I mean, I use the scale every day just to know if I ate something that my body didn't agree with or what the ramifications of that said food are. If I go up 2 pounds overnight, I know that I have some inflammation from something that I ate. So I use it as a tool, but I don't take it seriously. Oh, that looks like you question that.
Yeah, I do. So I don't, and bear in mind, I check my weight all the time. Weight, of course, is extremely clumsy.
Very.
You can gain a lot of weight that may have nothing to do with inflammation. For example, you quite literally just consumed and retained a lot more liquid, right? Or you built a lot more, particularly if it involves glycogen stores, which might still surprise you. But this weight's especially a good example of something where you want to be aware of trends. So 3 days of weight gain, that would be interesting, right? Let me put it this way. Let's say that my scale showed that I weighed 2.5 pounds more tomorrow. I probably wouldn't think twice about it. But let's say I gained a pound a day for 3 days. Oh, that would be more interesting to me, right? Bear in mind, these are pretty close to the same numbers. I just said a 1 day shift of 2.5, but I know that there's error rate. I know that my prior reading might be different, right? Like there might have been an error rate in my prior weight weighing myself, and then the day following there's an error rate in the other direction. It's possible. But that's why trends are more fascinating. because trends, there could be error rates, but if you're actually seeing something that seems somewhat consistent, then it becomes a lot more something where I would go, I wonder what habits I may have changed that could have made a difference. But that's a longer time scale, right? Now we're talking 3 days. I think 3 days can be relevant in that regard.
Yeah, what I've mainly found, cauliflower mac and cheese. If I eat cauliflower mac and cheese, I will gain 4 pounds overnight. I will be up 4 pounds. I will then wait. I will go back down those 4 pounds and I'll do it again. I will eat cauliflower mac and cheese and I will go up those same 4 pounds, and I can repeat it over and over and over again. So I don't know what it is. I'm not giving up cauliflower mac and cheese. I'm perfectly fine with that. And I don't stress out about the 4 pounds. But if I eat it 2 days in a row, I don't go up by 8 pounds.
Right, right.
I stay at that 4 pounds, and then I can continue to eat it for an entire week and I don't continue to go up.
Hmm.
It's very interesting. It could just be my scale is really bad, or maybe I have some other habit that goes along with the cauliflower mac and cheese, like you said, consuming more fluid or something like that. That's actually the culprit. That's not really the cauliflower mac and cheese.
And now you're thinking a lot more like a scientist. This is why the experiments I do often I even have a baseline diet that's fixed so that it's always the same even across other experiments. And now I love it because it gives me a baseline to compare against the other experiments to see if there's something different there, right? But that way I can isolate the intervention and know that I kept at least as many variables as I could constant throughout. In the case of exactly what you described, if I was eating something and it changed, it seemed to be something I gained weight on. Well, I have a brainless test that I've told friends and family about all the time, which is if you're not willing to regularly test your blood work, but you want to know if something's truly keto, just eat it all day. Because keto food, you take steak, right? I could eat steak all day long. I'm not going to gain weight. I'm probably going to lose weight because I can't overeat steak, right? And it's not very glycemic. Same thing with eggs. You could eat eggs all day long. You could be on an egg-only diet. I will lose weight and hold to a particular amount. But there's certain foods that I just do not keep in my house. For example, I like no sugar added dark chocolate covered almonds. I will eat them all. It doesn't matter. Like it's a problem food for me. And I know I couldn't eat them all the time. Because if I ate them all day long, then my glucose levels would not only go up, I'm confident my insulin levels would be higher in the morning and so forth. Of course, almonds themselves can, be glycemic depending on how much you're consuming. But that's part of how I can test. If I think something might be a problem food and I'm just being lazy, I'll be like, all right, I'm gonna eat a whole bunch of it, and then I'll just check my numbers in the morning. And if my glucose levels are through the roof in the morning and my weight's up and all that, then I'm like, okay, guess that's not it.
I guess that's maybe not your ketogenic food, and what doesn't work for you may work for someone else perfectly fine, because we're also individual. Although I do have a question. This was not on my list of questions at all for you today, but I am curious. One of the reasons that I actually went back to the higher fat was because when I did the higher protein, when I just did the eat the steak, my A1C went from 5.1 to 5.7. And all I had done was upped my protein intake. Do you have any insight on that? Because I really didn't change much else except for I lowered the fat and I upped the protein significantly. And I was still eating about the same amount of calories, actually, sometimes even less calories. But to go from a 5.1 to a 5.7 with a fully carnivore diet, I was very confused by that. So that's why I switched back to the higher fat from the higher protein. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear maybe if you have something.
So, and this actually is kind of interesting to dovetail off what I just mentioned. When I was talking about my glucose being high and then thus presumably my insulin levels being high, here's where I'm going to get into kind of a little bit more of a nuanced position I have that is also a little bit controversial. So I'll caveat it's a hypothesis, but it's one I do feel is kind of relevant also to the energy model in general, which is if you go to lean mass, a lot of lean mass hyperresponders I know have glucose levels, fasting glucose levels in the 90s or even low 100s. We'll have, say, an A1C of, say, between 5.5 and even 6.0, right? However, you put a CGM on them, and that continuous glucose monitor will show they're like a board. It's like just flat as a pond, right? And if you get their fasting insulin levels, it's not only below 5, oftentimes it's like below 2.5. So they have fasting insulin levels that are consistently super low, yet their glucose levels are higher than what you would expect and seem to be holding very steady in what looks like homeostasis, right? To me, this seems to be very suggestive of adaptive glucose sparing. It seems to me that, in fact, there's a systemic Randall cycle in that your body has a greater affinity for fatty acids and is sparing out the glucose levels, right? Now, because we're kind of hardwired, certainly I was coming into this, to look at not only fasting glucose, but also A1C in particular, it's hard to shake the possibility that you could have something like an A1C of 5.7 and not be flirting with diabetes. So I reiterate, this is a hypothesis, but if you look at the pathology of diabetes, you don't find that they just happen to have an A1C of 5.7, but like I was when my A1C was 6.1, I would get my fasting glucose, and my fasting glucose wouldn't be 100. It'd be 128, right? And my fasting insulin levels were well above 10. But now my fasting insulin levels, if they're below 5, I don't really care that much personally about my A1C, because I think that that's still a looser proxy for what I really care about, which is whether or not my body is successfully managing and maintaining my glucose levels to wherever it's wanting it to be. Now, that said, what I just described is fairly consistent as far as being in the 90s or low 100s. For example, I don't really know any lean mass hyperresponders who have, say, consistently, 140 fasting glucose levels, right? Even with having low insulin levels. I've just never seen that before. But that said, I would expect that if you are, having some level of adaptive glucose sparing, it's going to be some number that's higher than what would be expected for somebody who's, more sedentary, for example. But again, it's a hypothesis. We'll see in time as we get more data from these folks.
Okay, I had to look at my blood results. So let me see, my glucose was 91 when I had this done. It was a little while ago. My glucose was 91, and ironically, I honestly had not even looked at my insulin level.
What was your
I
insulin?
had these done, and this was like 6 months ago. 4.8.
Yep.
So now that you spell it out that way, I'm like, oh, interesting. I mean, granted, my pain is gone, so that's my thing. That was like, my pain was gone. I don't know what switched, but even if I include some more glucose or some more protein, it's weird. I'm messing with it now, but if I go too high on the protein too fast, my pain comes back. I don't understand that.
And that's figured out. That's in the scale of things, that's the meter that you care the most about, right? Like,
it is.
Of all the different tests you can do, your pain is the one of interest, right? But yes, but look, metabolic syndrome, and in particularly, especially diabetes, these are diseases of dysregulation, right? At their core, we can have all kinds of debate on how they start, how they progress, etc. But there's no question, if you get people with type 2 diabetes to get 7 days of labs in a row, you're going to see huge fluctuations. You're going to see their insulin and their glucose levels going up and down substantially, right? If they have type 1 diabetes, then it's insulin insufficiency. So even if they're not diagnosed yet, they have very low levels of insulin. And I have some respectful differences with some of my colleagues who are on the low carb side who think your insulin can get too low such that you basically emulate type 1 diabetes. But I disagree with them respectfully, because I'm like, well, then there would be no homeostasis. You'd see glucose levels going way up and way down and be progressive. It would be getting higher and higher and higher, and there'd be peaks and valleys. And if you put a CGM on them, it would be going up and down like a roller coaster.
Wouldn't their ketones be going up and up and up too?
Potentially, but that's of course super dangerous. You're talking DKA, right? Diabetic ketoacidosis.
Mm-hmm.
That's super crazy concerning if that's happening. But again, I'm an engineer. As an engineer, I'm like, well, I kind of know how to reverse engineer things that have outcomes that we can then look at and expect. And in terms of fuel, in terms of energy potential, levels of control seem to be something that we can look to in the case of diabetes. So pretty quickly you find that glucose is one thing that the body acts on more than it does on fat. And in particular, it seems that, yes, if your glucose gets above a certain level, it acts on that. If it gets below a certain level, it acts on that, such that it keeps this delta. What's the tightest delta I've ever seen with people who are super keto and metabolically healthy, that this line is so flat that you've got the Dexcom tech guy complaining to me that he doesn't have a lot to work with when I'm trying to, work out these details with him, because he never sees that, right? Now, again, it's a hypothesis, could be wrong. It might not be homeostasis, but it sure looks that way to me, because that's a super tight, how do you accomplish that under normal physiological circumstances if there isn't some degree of control that's being exerted? I don't know for sure, but I think that there is. I think it's a measure of successful control. And I wish that more of the thought process with medicine in particular would look at markers in this fashion, in a cascade that's combinatorial, and not try to isolate them out by themselves, particularly if they're a proxy for something else under a different context. So like in the case of A1C, we like it as a marker of diabetes because absent other information, it makes a lot of sense. We have this correlation. It is a cheap test to get, but you know what? We can improve upon the information we're gathering by looking at the CGM and the insulin levels, and then informing our opinion against this other data that's being collected. And this is why we've got to study lean mass hyperresponders. I know I'm totally biased when I say this, but I really do think this phenotype is going to teach us so much about not just lipid physiology, but just overall metabolism, because we needed to just get to this point where we had what is presumably a generally healthy population that exhibits these attributes and can provide us this level of data. So that's a lot of my work right now is not just studying them, but getting other people interested in the research realm to consider this very thing I'm telling you right now. It's the only way we get there.
Yes, doing these studies. Absolutely. I'm going to totally shift here and ask one more question, because we've gone on for a minute and a half. So we're talking about tests. So I'm going to bring in CAC, the coronary artery calcification scan, for anyone who doesn't know. That's kind of the calming test for a lot of people, that my LDL is up the roof, my total cholesterol is going crazy, so I'm going to go get the CAC scan. And then it comes back like mine is a 0. My husband's was a 1. They wanted to put him on a statin with a score of 1. I think I made the pharmacist cry. I was very nice, but I was like, honey, have you ever seen the Framingham study? Anyways, so I have had those people though that come back with their CAC much higher than they want it to be. And they are very, very worried that, being the age that they are, we'll say above 60s, they have the high CAC score of over 400, they're worried about whether or not they can eat a ketogenic diet or if it's going to contribute to the problem. Do you have any insight on that? And I know so much of it is a hypothesis, but if it was you, if you were in your 70s and you got the CAC scan of 400 and something, what would you do? Would you continue to eat a low carb diet or would you change things up?
So a few things. One, I love the CAC. In fact, I love it more than I ever have before, because I'm going to tell you about a study in a second. But I will say, for those who don't already know about it, particularly if you're making a major lifestyle change, especially if it's with diet, you may want to consider getting it sooner rather than later. Because one of the most heartbreaking things is when somebody's getting their very first CAC and they're, say, 4 years into the ketogenic diet or any diet, and it's higher than they were expecting, and they're going, wait, how much of this is, due to the diet, right? Well, here's the problem. Calcifying of your arteries is a very long process. That's, well established. In fact, it's ironic because the non-calcified plaque, that can actually build up relatively quickly. But calcification is usually a fairly long process. It's lifelong, and whatever your lifestyle and your diet was before that time could have contributed to it. But here's the other part. I certainly believe, and I'm not the only one. You can, the person who brought us the test, Arthur Agustin, let's say that we knew the perfect diet, the perfect intervention you could go on right now on day 0. Odds are some amount of the existing soft plaque, existing injuries to your vasculature, etc. Odds are some amount of that is going to continue to calcify past day 0. Whatever that perfect intervention is, there's a kind of inertia, because guess what? That's part of the healing process. It's the actual stabilization of plaques. You don't typically have heart attacks from calcified plaques. They're not the ones that are breaking off. It's usually a good proxy for the existing level of your cardiovascular system. That said, not always, right? But yes, CAC is a great place to start. It's true if you have a 0, that's a fairly good sign. It's a fairly good proxy for, what your future risk is, especially in like the next 10 to 15 years, right? With some obvious caveats. But the study that really brought things home for me was one out of Denmark. I want to say it was in February or March of this year. And if you do a search in my Twitter, I'm Real Dave Feldman. In Twitter, do a search on my name, and I think I used the hashtag mega thread. I do a mega thread on this study because it's fantastic. I think it was every single person who got a CTA in Denmark between 2008 and 2017. And they were all symptomatic. Basically, if you were going to go get a CTA, and I'm sorry, CTA is a CT angiogram. So CT angiogram looks at both calcified plaque and non-calcified plaque. And it's the highest resolution non-invasive scan. It's what we're using, by the way, for our LMHR study. So 23,000 folks who were all symptomatic. So they had some kind of chest pain or something such that it would refer them to get the CT angiogram. This study looks at that whole population, and it found that indeed, if you have a CAC that's higher, it tended to be more associated with likely future events, right? But interestingly, LDL cholesterol did not have that strong of an association with symptomatic patients, such that it wasn't that predictive of future events. And this is whether your calcification was high or it was low. But it also tended to be a good proxy against the likelihood of you having non-calcified plaque. So if memory serves, and I could be wrong about this, I think only 0.5% of those who had a CAC of 0 actually had at least one site of an occlusion of plaque that was, say, above 50%. So typically, if you had a CAC that was above 0, you had demonstrable heart disease. Almost nobody had a fairly demonstrable level of heart disease if they had a CAC of 0, right? Okay, so where I'm going with this is, that isn't to say that I myself or somebody else who, if I found that my CAC was up, that I wouldn't, feel I was in a very different context and might take steps to lower my saturated fat or lower my cholesterol and so forth. I don't know. All of those are on the table. I've not actually been in that position. And I regularly caveat that I don't actually look that much into secondary prevention, because in looking to secondary prevention, that kind of takes me off the road of where I'm at right now, because that's the cart, and the horse for me is whether or not the LDL, or in particular the Apob containing lipoproteins, are driving the development of the atherosclerosis. So I say this because I want people to feel their decision is their own. And I would want them to look, not just at those of us who might be a little more optimistic, but please look, work with your doctor, look at the existing conventional opinion, and, learn everything you can about it. Talk to your family, and so on and so forth. But all of that said, there's nothing to me that beats looking at the actual disease. Nothing. So I myself, why I'm not in this context yet, is my LDL has been elevated for, a substantial amount of time, being low carb, high fat, but I don't take it lightly. I've had 2 CT angiograms. I've had 3 CACs. And now that we're doing the study, I can't actually talk about it yet, but after the study's done, I'll talk about that again, because now my data's, it's funny because what I say individually now matters a bit more to like ethics committees and so forth, because it could look as though I'm making use of it as a recruitment tool, right? It's weird. It's, in many ways, I feel like I'm kind of graduating into this sort of politician role, which I don't love, because I like being able to just talk about a lot of this stuff openly, especially data, for transparency reasons and so forth. But what do you do? But yeah, I realize that's kind of a nuanced answer. But all that said, find out for yourself and make your decision, but it's an individual decision to make.
Just like with diet.
Just like with diet.
Yeah, although I am going to ask you another question. I don't know if you can share this or not. Can you share what you typically eat in a day macro wise, like more fat, protein, carbs? Do you even have, do you know? Can you share?
I haven't actually accounted for that recently. I will say that my diet hasn't, I do best when I'm very keto. And I'll concede that I tend to be low carb when I'm not. So keto being, my gross carbs are 30 or less. Low carb being under 100 gross carbs. Lately, I've been more low carb. So probably closer to like 50, 60 gross carbs, something along those lines. And frankly, a little bit of that's just straight up laziness. Like, I tend to not cook as much. So I tend to have, okay, I'll give you a good example. Marco's Pizza has these pizza bowls. So I'll get a pizza bowl. It doesn't have a crust, but it does have the red sauce, right? And, I will sometimes use their Parmesan cheese, and the Parmesan cheese is like the packaged Parmesan cheese. It's a little bit not carby, but it's got carbs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my guess is, if I were to sit down and account for it, I'm probably closer to like 50, 60 during the week, something along those lines. But when I'm being good, I'll have burgers without buns. I'll have steak a bit more. I'll have salmon. I'll have lots and lots of eggs, and cheese. I have lots of cheese. I have a lot of Northern European ancestry in me, so we literally have lactose persistence, not lactose intolerance.
Mm-hmm.
So cheese is very much a part of my life. I'll just put it that way.
I love that. So thank you. We're going to call it, because we've been on for a while. So thank you so much for coming on and talking with us today. I'm going to link everything down below. So Dave's going to send me all of his information, all of his links are going to be down below. One more shameless plug for the Own Your Labs down below. Be a part of the testing, please. Click the box, make sure that you're sharing this so that you can be a part of the solution and not, a part of the problem, right? Exactly. So thank you so much, and we will definitely keep in touch.
Great. Thank you for having me on, Amy.